In the last episode, informing them that the remnants of the Hermes had used emergency protocols to land. The crew readied themselves for a lengthy journey, but with the planet's climate rapidly shifting, and a fire leading to the destruction of their generators, and so their only way of making industrial components, the team saw little choice but to pack up all of their belongings and head out into the big, wide world to find the Hermes and attempt to use it to get off the planet. And so the crew set off with an estimated journey of about 19 days. They knew the location of the nearby volcano from the old survivor's notes, and so they knew they'd have to travel around the mountain range to the south before they could loop round and head north to the landing site. They were all anxious, but excited to finally be on the move, and hoped the journey would go smoothly. On their first night, they saw a new, strange biome in the distance, which looked like a swampy version of the Ashland biome. They didn't want to risk camping in the unknown territory, and so decided to set up camp in the Ashland plains that they knew. They set up camp in a hollowed-out cave, most of them too tired to even set up tents. They were out of practice with travelling, and they were all exhausted after their first day. Prissy tried to help her mum by looking after Lexi. Kivy was approaching her third trimester now, and the travel alone was taking its toll. She needed all the rest she could get, so she could get to the ship as quickly as possible to give birth in safety. The following morning, the crew milked the bovine beetles, packed up, and once again headed off into the unknown, further and further south. That night they crossed into a volcanic landscape, and had no choice but to rest in this hostile environment. The site was new to most of the colony, but for the original trio, it brought back memories of their original journey. Thankfully, they were much more organised this time round, and had no need to spend their time scavenging for food and resources to keep them alive. And they all slept fairly soundly in the safety of their group. The next morning, they once again milked their bovine beetles, packed up, and set off, attempting to keep to their schedule as much as possible. And with no end to the volcanic terrain in sight, they settled down once more to a rough sleep next to the pools of lava, thankfully with enough milk to ward off their thirst. Mid-next morning, they finally saw an end to the volcanoes, but instead of lava, a strange crimson forest lay before them. The strangely alien biome was unlike anything they'd seen before, and all were hesitant to set foot in it. Thankfully, it was at this moment that Kivy went into labour. And so they quickly set up camp and tried to get Kivy comfortable, out in the open, surrounded by the colony's menagerie, during a lightning storm, and with everyone watching her. Thankfully, the excitement wore off after labour went into the night, and once everyone else had fallen asleep, Kivy gave birth to a beautiful, healthy boy, which they decided to call Danny. Aliona dedicated herself to taking care of Danny, and to be in charge of childminding on the trip. The colony had little use for her skills during the journey, and she saw this as the best use of her abilities. So she stayed up with Danny, hoping and praying to all the gods she knew that they'll be able to escape this planet safely. The next morning they set off once again. Global warming was scorching the planet, and they knew they had to press on and get away and travel north as quickly as possible. Thankfully, they found water again, but it ran through the strange ocular forest that they had seen before. The forest was sickly looking, containing strange trees and animals that all had strange eye-like features, making the colony feel like they were constantly being watched. Kivy and Agent stayed awake out in the open, trying to reassure a nervous Ash and a frightened baby. Agent was meant to be on watch, but had fallen asleep in a heap with Lexi and Prissy, leaving Kivy alone with her thoughts, feeding Danny whilst the forest watched them from afar. The next morning they set off through this ocular forest. The temperature was getting warmer and warmer, and they all knew they needed to hurry north to get to the colder climate. They worried the children and the bovine beetles wouldn't be able to survive, and so to combat the heat, the team decided to walk through the night in the hopes of getting further north and out of the strange forest. The following day, after marching through the night, they came to the end of the ocular forest and instead found a mycotic jungle, the fungus-filled forest they had seen previously. And so they had a quick rest to escape the afternoon's heat and travelled through the fungal jungle by night. They were all in surprisingly good moods despite everything. They still had plenty of food, and although they could do a better sleep, they were all coping well with the conditions they were in. Despite this, they knew they couldn't keep up the pace forever. But by this point they had looped round the mountain range, and they hoped their journey north to the ship would be under much more reasonable conditions. And so, with no end to the mycotic jungle in sight, and with the temperature marginally more tolerable, they decided to set up camp and properly rest after trekking on minimal sleep for days. The jungle was as strange as Kivy, Aliona, and Buck remembered, and the purple landscape littered with giant mushrooms and poisonous gases. Exhausted, the team set up camp and passed out then and there, sleeping straight through the day and the night. But there was a surprise. One of the fertilized bovine beetle eggs that they had collected by chance had hatched, and the new addition to the group brought renewed hope and reminded the original three of their first journey once again. They all knew they could get through these struggles and reach the other side. And so in the morning they packed up and headed further north, through the thick mushroom forest. They estimated they had about 11 days left to travel, and were making good time. With the temperature being more mild and their good rest, moods continued to be high, but they had a surprise in store. The following morning they saw an end to the mycotic jungle, and in front of them, a sprawling grassland lay. And so the crew rushed as quickly as possible to get there. That night they relaxed, finally in an Earth-like biome, reminiscent of their old base. But while most slept, Kivy stayed awake with Lexi. The whole colony was concerned about Lexi. Was she really okay to raise as one of their own? Was she safe to take with them on the Hermes? What would she grow into? None of them knew, but they had grown fond of her. She was just like any of the other children, really. Their differences seemed only skin deep right now, and so they decided to continue to care for her, and hoped that if they could escape the planet, that they could take Lexi with them, and give her a chance of a different life than the one she would have had on this planet. Whilst this was happening, Aliona was being a reasonable caregiver, letting the tiny Danny sleep amongst the giant beasts of burden. Nothing bad could possibly happen from letting an infant sleep on the ground, in the rain, surrounded by multiple giant insects. The next morning they pressed on with their journey. The grassland stretched off into the distance. Although hilly, it was a much nicer biome to walk through compared to the journey's previous ones. And so they kept travelling, until they saw a river that looked like the perfect place to camp for the night. Ash, or Prissy as she liked to be known, was now 10, and with the trip, she was keenly thinking about the future. Her mother's strange teaching methods has paid off, and she was turning into a well-educated individual. Wanting to keep exploring the wilderness, shooting plants and animals were good things to focus on, and all the travelling and her life in general had led her to become a hardy individual, better at coping with extreme temperatures and against disease and injury. She truly represented the colony's life on the planet thus far. With her adulthood fast approaching, Kivy could only hope that she could adjust to life away from this planet, if they were able to leave. They slept well that night and into the following day. The children, once again with Aliona, safely on the floor next to the giant beetles. They soon packed up and continued on, and were extremely glad they decided to make enough food before travelling, as it made the journey much more copable than the first time round. With just 7 days left of travelling, it was now a straight shot to the landing site, and it seemed like it would be grassland most of the way, and they continued their journey in peace. One night in particular, a beautiful aurora appeared, boosting their already high moods. Ash and Kiko stayed up late, watching it with wonder, enjoying each other's company in the tranquil environment. Aliona once again slept outside with the babies. It was clear at this point that making her chief caregiver was a poor decision, but under this warm, peaceful night, under the beautiful sky, they gave her a pass. Day after day they continued on through the grassland, setting up camp as usual each night, until they came to a biome Kivy, Aliona, and Buck recognized well, a Galatros graveyard, like the one they had landed on when they first arrived on the planet. The second night in this eerie biome showed it off fully. Bones of giants littered the landscape, with little vegetation and only boom rats occupying the morbid terrain. It was a stark contrast to the luscious grassland that they had just been in. Still, the boom rats seemed friendly enough, playing long into the night, much to the chagrin of Brutus, who seemed to be the focus of most of their fun. The following morning they woke, milked their beetles once again, and set off back towards the comforting grassland. Day after day, night after night, they trekked through the familiar terrain, children sleeping with the beetles as usual. This part of the journey was bliss for the group. The weather was fine, there was plenty of water, and they made good time, and with only 2 days left until they would arrive at the ship, they were all excited and keen to get there, to the extent that they decided to trek through the night to try and make it to the ship as soon as possible. As it passed into the next day, it was Kiko, or Lady as she liked to be known's, birthday. She was a very happy, bubbly child who always seemed to be having fun. Even when thinking about the future, she simply wanted to do more meaningful work and play with mischievous cats. So shooting, social, and artistic skills seemed to be the thing that she would be best at. She had shown through her fun nature that she was easily amused, and always saw the bright side of life. She had been a beacon of light to the group through the dark and often depressing life on this Rimworld, a stark contrast to her older sister, but a worthwhile colonist nonetheless. Despite their optimism, the group passed out from exhaustion before they could reach the ship's landing site, and all fell asleep in a heap. That night they experienced the first potential threat to the trip, with wargs circling the camp, looking for a quick meal. Agent, wanting to protect his family, offered to stay up and keep watch, but thankfully it wasn't needed, and without incident, they packed up the next morning and set off towards the ship. They had travelled across the planet, had sleepless nights, encountered strange animals and biomes, but they had made it safely to the Hermes, and were all excited to set eyes on it once again. It lay there in the middle of the grassland, a skeleton of what it once was, but it seemed to be in working order. It had enough crypto sleep caskets for all of them, with some spare, something they all breathed a sigh of relief about. And it seemed in good working condition, despite everything. They set up camp next to the ship. The AI had said that it needed time to start the ship up before it could take off. And so they knew they needed to set up a proper camp and stay there a while, so that they could defend the ship before it could take off. After about 10 days, they had started to work on the layout of a base. They had a warehouse, makeshift bedrooms, and they had a crafting room and kitchen in the center. They had set up farms with the seeds they collected. Their food had all but run out, and at this point they were desperate for their first crop to grow. The biome had few animals, and the only edible plants were berries outside the base. Water was also in short supply, with only a small lake adjacent. Still, they needed water, and so they set about making a well and plumbing it to bring water into the base. But with little wood on the map and no coal to speak of, it was a struggle to make steel. Making generators, air conditioning, or crafting weapons near impossible. With the heat and the lack of food, the crew decided to release a few of the bovine beetles into the wild. They were reluctant to do this after everything they had been through, but they knew they wouldn't be able to take them all with them anyway, and it was kinder for them to release them now. Reginald busied himself with trying to improve the makeshift base. Moods were at an all-time low, and with resources also low, he needed to do everything he could to make sure the colony was happy. But with the heat came complications. The bovine beetles were simply not suited to it, and were suffering from heat stroke. They were now in extreme pain, and the team worried they wouldn't be able to survive the climate shift. With no way of making chem fuel and little wood, they decided to conserve the remaining fuel so that when they had steel, they could make and power a biofuel refinery. Once they had that, they would once again have unlimited fuel from refining their waste. But until they got steel, they were stuck. They looked around extensively, but could find no coal in the surrounding hills. They were at a standstill. The bovine beetles kept getting worse, and so the colony decided to do what they could. They saved the original 3 beetles, Fifi, Rocky, and Nika, and carried them to crypto sleep caskets on the ship. At least this way, some of them may survive. But unfortunately, they didn't think they could take them all. The others would have to try and fight to survive until they could find a solution. That was when a psychic ship chunk came crashing down, filled with strange mechanoids they hadn't seen before, and damaging the moods of all the already depressed colonists. The ship chunk was a considerable threat, but they didn't feel like they had the resources to deal with it now. Unfortunately, as Kivy desperately tried to move the bovine beetles inside, one of them perished to the heat. With only minutes to spare, Agent and Kivy managed to save the last 2 beetles on the verge of death, and with the marginal differences in temperature inside, a heat stroke managed to subside. The death of the beetle was sad, but the colony was desperate for food and resources. None of the beetle would go to waste. It would feed the colony, keep them alive for another day, and it would go towards replacing some of their travel-damaged clothes. At least this way, they could respect it in death. Between this and the psychic drone though, it was all too much for Kepe, and in a fit of rage decided to destroy the ship's reactor. None of them knew why he would do such a thing. Kepe hardly knew himself at this point. From the long journey and the life in squalor for weeks on end, it had become too much for him. Thankfully, Agent arrested him before he could damage the reactor too much, and soon Reginald fixed it back up to be as good as new. After this, Kepe calmed down considerably, and was released shortly after. After a painfully long time, they finally got enough steel together to make a wind turbine for the water pump, and the colony finally had access to fresh water, after coping for almost a season. Despite the passive water cooler they had installed in the main part of the base, the bedrooms were still ridiculously hot. But without any wood or power, they were stuck. They focused on keeping the babies and the bovine beetles cool enough to survive with the meager amounts of wood they'd collected. Everything was waiting on the biofuel refinery. They just needed enough material to get it operational, and then they could have all the power they would ever need through their fecal sludge. Reginald went round deconstructing all the wrecks and metallic objects he could find, but sadly, it barely put a dent in their steel deficit. So with the 2 remaining ranged weapons, Kivy and Agent decided they would get the much needed supplies from the only remaining source on the map, the psychic ship chunk. The mechs awoke and charged towards them after the first few shots. Kivy focused fire on the strange mechanoid with wings that seemed to float across the landscape towards them with speed. But the mechs took many hits and didn't seem to fall. Sensing Kivy's fear, Brutus charged into the mechs to take them head on. Brutus didn't stand a chance against these steel monstrosities, but it gave Kivy and Agent time to fire enough shots into them to weaken them and slow them down. After the brawl, Brutus was once again left a bloody mess on the floor. He was badly injured, and they weren't sure if even he would survive this time round. But Kivy and Agent kept trying to kite the mechanoids. After the first mech fell, however, the floating mech decided to go back to protect the ship chunk, giving Kivy and Agent time to finish the remaining mech off, and for Reginald to rush to Brutus to try and patch him up. It would be a close call as to if he would survive. Not waiting to see what would happen, Kivy and Agent rushed down the floating mech that they'd named an Aura. The fight was closer than they would have liked, but they eventually took it down without suffering any injuries. Back with Brutus, it was clear that Reginald had patched him up quick enough, was no longer in any danger of bleeding out. Kivy breathed a sigh of relief, and once she made sure he was safe, her and Agent focused on taking the ship down. The ship chunk provided enough steel and slag for the biofuel refinery, with some spare, and even some materials they could use for other things. And so, soon after the biofuel refinery was set up, Reginald got his hands dirty and set to work turning all their waste into chem fuel for power. It was a messy job, but someone had to do it. Aliona showed Ash and Kiko the mechanoids up close, and demonstrated to them how to deconstruct them. By doing so, she produced more materials and components that they could use for power generation. The base was coming along. Progress with the walls was slow, but the first layer was almost complete, and they all felt a bit safer because of it. With wood a scarce resource, Reginald replaced all the wooden furniture with bone. It was fairly morbid, but it was the only resource they had ample supply of, and they were pretty desperate at this point. But it wasn't long before they had a chem fuel generator. Aliona had been up all night smelting the slag from the mechanoids on their ship, trying to get ahead with steel production, which they were still lacking, despite everything. With the first supply of chem fuel fed into the generator, the power could be turned on once again, and the production of components, as well as air conditioning for the main room, could resume. But not everyone was happy with the slow progress they were making. They were still severely short on food, and foraging enough for each day was hard. And so once again, Kepe snapped, slaughtering one of the bovine beetles that had worked so hard to keep alive. He was starving, and angry that the beetles' lives were being prioritized over the colonists. And in his eyes, he did what he knew had to be done. The death of the beetle was sad, but this time around the colony knew Kepe had probably done the right thing. They were all starving, and just the sight of raw insect meat was enough to send everyone into a frenzy, grabbing fistfuls of the slimy meat and stuffing it raw into their mouths. It wasn't pretty, but this was what they had to do to survive. They drew the line though when Kepe went to slaughter Brutus as well. Aliona quickly arrested Kepe before he could enact his rage, and put him back into his room, something that had become a recurring event within the colony. Despite the setbacks, the team finally managed to build a machining table out of the components and steel that they had worked so hard to obtain, something they all celebrated by holding a party. Using this, they would finally be able to make enough guns for everyone. The guns wouldn't be anything special, only bolt-action rifles, but it was the best they could make, was better than anything else that they had had up until now. The crew celebrated their major milestone long into the night. They'd overcome the odds, and somehow managed to make it here, set up a decent temporary base, and arm themselves, ready for the fight that was yet to come. It had taken them almost half a year to get to this point, but they hoped that this was the turning point for them, and that their moods could only get higher from now on. But with this happiness came problems as usual. A few days later, mechanoid drop pods were seen crashing near the base, containing multiple scyther and paramedics. Mechs were trouble, but with their lack of resources, they were also a blessing in disguise, each one brimming with steel and components. Kivy and Agent tried to attack with the element of surprise, and attacked the smaller group before they had chance to join the others. Thankfully, all the mechs were melee fighters, and Kivy used her long-range rifle to lure them out and take them out one by one. After dealing with the smaller group, they focused on the larger one, which thankfully only had one cipher in it, and the rest simply paramedics, which weren't really much of a threat. After focusing on the cipher for hours, they finally brought it down, and Brutus ran in to finish the paramedics off with brute force. The sheer amount of mechs led to a boom in steel, and a migration of Muffalo to the area provided them with the food that they had so desperately been needing. And it wasn't long before Danny became more independent and became a child. The colony had struggled, they had had highs and lows, but Kivy had brought a child into this world under less than ideal circumstances, and the crew had kept this child alive, battling starvation and climate over the past 3 seasons. And whilst their progress was slow, the colonists were all alive, and that was the most important thing. And on day 270, Reginald finally started putting together the first colony-made guns for them. It had been a long time coming, but soon they would finally be able to defend themselves properly, and at that point, they could start the ship's engines and face their final battle. So thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you've liked what you've seen, please leave a like and subscribe. A massive thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube members: Clint, David, Valise, Lorby Lord, T Chaos, Toolman, Nacho Cheese, King of Thorns, Charles, Latz, Brian, Heretic, and PWR Wolf. So cheers, everyone, and I will see you next episode, which will be the final one. Bye-bye.